Other news, the prosecution is wrapping up its case in the trial of a 26-year-old man who illegally entered the country and is accused of murdering Georgia nursing student Laken Riley. On the third day of the trial today, the judge heard more testimony from law enforcement officers and medical examiners about the gruesome crime. Jose Ibarra from Venezuela has pleaded not guilty to murder and other charges in connection to the death of Riley, who was killed on a morning jog in February.
She has a combination of abrasions, which are scrapes, as well as contusions, which is just a fancy medical way of saying a bruise, so bleeding under the skin, as well as lacerations.
Defense attorneys plan to present testimony from witnesses, including the defendant's brother. They argue there is not sufficient evidence for a conviction. Ibarra waived his right to a jury trial, and the judge will be deciding the case.